This is my dragon. This is the second layer of color. So this light area you see, I drew it, transferred it to this because I wanted it on clean paper, and then I got the first layer wet. Now I come in, I put this second layer of color, and these are Derwent Inktense colored pencils. They're watercolor pencils. So what I do is I can layer these colors, and then I get it wet again. The difference of these is that they're ink-based. So that means that normal watercolor pencil would re-wet. So like you see, the pencil is turning to paint here. And I have to work fairly fast because these are permanent when they dry. They also stain the paper. So I will have a line if I work too slow and the edge of the water has pigment, and if it's dark enough it will stain that paper, and then I'll have a line I can't get rid of. So for those of you that don't know much about mediums, watercolor is water-based. Pretty simple. Watercolor pencil is also water-based. It's a pencil of basically hardened watercolor paint and other ingredients. You draw, you can get it wet, it then turns into watercolor paint. The nature of watercolor is that it is always water soluble. No matter how long between when you work on the artwork and it gets dry. I had to remove some of that water. I'd have had too big of a puddle in here. To get this tiny detail area, I can't have too much water, or it'll just flood the area, and then it'll run into the other areas. As long as I keep the water where I want it, it works scientifically. You guys know about surface tension of water. That's what I'm dealing with here. As long as I keep part of the paper dry, the part that's wet will not run into what is dry, which also means I have to work in sections. So anyway, back to the nature of watercolor. Once it's dry, you can re-wet it. It could be 50 years later, you can re-wet it. Now, that can be cool because you can fix things, right? Maybe scrub off some of that color. But it also means that things can run together. So I'm putting this red over that orange that was underneath, and if I have it thin, you can see what was underneath. Now, normal watercolor, it would just blend into a new color and you wouldn't even notice that there was something separate underneath. The other cool thing that I can do is like over here where there's blue and purple, I can keep the blue blue. It won't turn purple when that other color gets wet. So those are some neat things I can do with these. So yeah, back to the nature. These aren't normal watercolor, these are ink-based. So once every single tiny granule of pencil has been wet and manipulated with the water, see, I'm trying to force the pigment to go in certain spots. That's why I'm tapping and moving and doing things. Once they're all dry, that ink is permanent. So that means I can come back in with a color that would normally mix and maybe make a brown or just a muddy color. and it won't. So you guys know enough about color if you've been in my classes that the complementary colors like blue and orange, if I put orange with blue, it turns to brown. With this, that doesn't happen. I can put orange on top of a blue, and as long as the one has been dried, it will not turn brown. The orange or blue, whichever is underneath, will still be there and will still stay that true color from before. So I can also control how dark or light it gets by how much water I add, and I can control whether it's a detail or it becomes more of a wash. This would be a wash. It's nice and thin. So it just depends on what I'm wanting. So these scales, I want them to kind of keep their form. Doesn't mean I won't come over them with a wash at a later date, but for now, so I'm not making it super watery because I want it to hold its form. And then again, I also have to be careful about the wetness up against it. If I added a bunch of water right through here, right now, I would end up with this running into it. And in order to make this stand out against this, I need it to be a different color. And so I'm going to have to wait with adding that second color. So for now, I'll just do this thin layer, which you could technically say this is a wash as well, because I'm just doing a thin layer of this over the area, just so that it's all kind of the same tone, so that whatever I put on it next kind of looks the same and doesn't have a different look to it. So I'm just tapping. That keeps those colors where I want them. Now this horn is not really standing out right now, but I have many more layers to go. So I will do something to that, which will make it stand out. You can see how I'm still able to wet some of this and scrub through this because there's still some pigment in there, but see how it's creating a little bit of a line. So it takes some doing, some practice playing with these to figure out how you want them to work. So now I'm going to let that area dry, and I'm going to come over here and I'm just going to work, I think I'll work this area right here. So the other thing I do is where it's thinner here, I'll start with more water, and I'll work towards the area of more concentration. So that keeps that line I talked about, of there sometimes being like a water line, that kind of keeps that from happening through here. Now I can push water up into here, because I want this to have a shape to it. It's a dragon, but they almost have wings that look like bat wings. They're very thin membranes stretched over bones. So they're much more bat-like than bird-like. So I want them to have that shading that gives them depth. See how I'm like keeping this area nice and wet? That way I'm not going to get a strange line. I also move it so that my hand is at the best angle. It's a little tricky because I want to keep you where the camera can see you. Got the camera just suspended over my artwork, so I have to look up and see if I can even, if you can see what I'm doing. Oops, see, now that got in there. I don't want that in there. That's damp. I'm going to have to be very careful. See, I can still get details. I just have to decide when and where. So So like I don't want a distinct line necessarily. So if I want that to kind of soften, get a little of that off my brush. I'm going to need a little more water. Dilute that, see? So it's a trial and error. I've been doing this quite a while. I've been working in this medium, I'd say at least 5 years. And it's one of the primary mediums I work in. So I have used this quite a bit. And before that I did a lot of colored pencil and watercolor pencil work. So it's like you do the drawing and then you decide, not always does everything get re-wet when I'm done. Sometimes for the finishing touches, it'll stay this dry. And that's the other cool thing with watercolor pencil, is that you have the ability of turning it to paint. It's your choice. It depends on what's best for the drawing. So this is not touching this, so I could get that wet now too. So you got to work in sections, and sometimes you get yourself to where you've just got to stop for a little bit. See that drop of water hit that? I had to get that up before it caused some unchangeable thing on there. So this is under this wing and attached to this muscle. So it's supposed to be darker. I'll probably have to add another, oop, there's more splatters. I'll probably have to add another layer to get this as dark as it needs to be. But for now, this is fine. You ready? I'll go ahead and put this. Now my brush is not very wet, which can backfire later. Because like I said, if every piece of pigment hasn't gotten wet, if I just brush over this and kind of blend it, then there might be some dry pigment down in here that could re-wet a few layers from now if it's not all wet and dry. So that is something else I have to consider when I'm doing it. Now there is a way to test it. You take a wet brush that's clear water, meaning it's a clean brush. Test it to make sure it's completely clear water. Like you can come down to another spot and do that, and it's just clear water. Then I run that over that area that I'm testing, and then take it to another sheet of paper with just paper and test it and see if there's any pigment that got picked up. If nothing got picked up, then I know everything was wet and it's now permanent. So that's a way to test it if I'm doing something crucial. Like if I was going to put a blue shadow through what I'm painting right now, or a blue highlight, I would want to make sure that this is permanent now, or I could have a mess on my hands. Another way to do it, if I suspect there's dry pigment under there, is to be very quick about it. Because if I just ran a wash of blue through it after it's dry and was quick, it would maybe turn a little bit brown on the edges, but it's not gonna like work in. But if I get in there with my brush and stir things around, it's definitely gonna start releasing what's underneath and mixing it. So part of it is technique, part of it is knowing your medium. Okay, well that's a pretty good area. And for now, I think that's all I can do, because I have to wait for this to dry so I can put my hand there. When it's dry too, I'll lay a piece of paper there so that my greasy hands, well, not that my hands are always greasy, but you know, if my hand's dirty or just normal skin oils, I don't want that getting on the piece either. If it's out here, I'm fine, but I have to be careful about that too. So I will keep posting videos as I work on this piece of artwork. I hope to finish it in the next week, and I'll keep you posted.